If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what's your most downright and unexplainable paranormal encounter? A buddy and I were going down a country road and a beach ball-sized glowing ball of light crossed in front of us, hovering about 3 feet off the ground. I saw it, and after about 30 seconds of silence he looked at me and was like, "You saw that shit too, right?" It was following the power lines, like how when you're in a wooded area and they clear the area where the power lines go through. The only other one that comes to mind was pulling up to my house, middle of the woods, so nothing around. As soon as I parked, something hit the roof of my truck so hard I nearly shit myself. Like literally waited 5 minutes before getting out. There was nothing. I thought maybe a big ass bird dive bombed me, but never heard anything after the initial noise and never saw anything. One beautiful day, 2 couples were on a hike to a cottage they rented out. Through hours of hiking, they finally reached their destination. Once the 2 couples got settled in, one couple and the boyfriend, let's call him George, of the other couple decided to continue venturing on, see what was around. The girlfriend of George, let's call her Sarah, felt too tired to continue hiking, so decided to stay behind. Time goes by, night falls, and a heavy storm ensues. Worried, Sarah tries calling the rest of the group, but nobody picks up. Moments pass by and Sarah hears a knock on the door. It's the group, they're finally back. But without George. They simply reply, "We're so sorry. We couldn't save him." They look all beaten up, scratched, like they got into an accident, and it's as if they looked like they saw a ghost. Blank stares of terror. As Sarah stares at the couple as disbelief. She shuts the door and cries in the front room. The other couple decide to head to bed. As Sarah continued to cry, she saw a figure in the distance. Waving. She couldn't quite make out what it was. Until there he was. Standing in the middle of the field. Being flushed with mixed emotions, Sarah bolts out the door to see if it was really him. As she gets up to him, George grabs her by the hand and sprints faster than he ever did. As they're running, he says out of breath, "They all died." I'm sure this can be explained in some way, but I think like 3 rhymes throughout my life I've woken up and saw myself looking at me. Like, I'm still in my body and in bed, but this person that looks like me but with gray tinted skin is just looking at me. Then I become fully awake and aware and they're not there. It's not a scary experience either, it's just weird. I saw shadow people for a week on a farm my grandfather's brother owns. So yeah, I used to live in a kinda small town in Sweden and my grandfather's brother has a farm there, only a sheep farm. Anyway, my second cousin I think it's called, and I had 2 pit bikes. Small dirt bikes, so we are driving around for a while just joking around. Suddenly I see things in the edge of my sight. But when I look, nothing is there. So I think maybe it's just a hallucination. Fast forward 5 hours and it's dark. We put back the dirt bikes as we head up to go to bed. I look out as the moonlight is lighting up a field and I saw maybe 60 shadow things in the edges. I saw some come closer and closer, and in the end I started hearing branches and leaves. So I run inside, lock the door, and run up to his room to tell him something is in the front yard. He gets up, we both look. And there are drag lines in the gravel. Almost like someone just dragged their feet around. After that nothing happened. But in the morning we saw 4 pairs all leading around the house. I was so freaked out I got on my dirt bike and drove home. And well, thought I've seen ghosts and an alien looking at me through my window too. This happened when I was about 10 years old. My dad had taken my brother, a couple friends, and me off-road go-karting in a small rural town in northern Mexico, about 40 miles south from where we lived. On our way back late at night, we came up to a red light at an intersection. On the opposite corner there was a cemetery on the left side of the road. While we were waiting at the red light, there was another car directly in front of us with their lights on. I remind you, this was late and dark in a rural town with dirt roads also waiting. And another car who had the green light passed from right to left, lifting up a cloud of dirt. In that cloud of dirt that was left, with the car that was in front of us with his lights on, you could clearly see the silhouettes of what appeared to be an adult and 2 kids walking across the street in the opposite direction of the cemetery. The crazy thing about this is that all 6 of us in the car saw it happen. To this day I can't explain what happened or how it happened. I've asked my dad 18 years later if he remembers, and he does, but he also can't explain what it was. One time when I was a kid, maybe 9 years old, I was at my great-grandmother's house in the basement. Her house was quite unusual and had a lot of hidden passageways and hidden doors. She had a large walk-in closet and there was a center fixture that held a bunch of fur coats, room full of coats on walls and also in central fixture. The center fixture kind of made the room have a circular path. I ran around in circles and circles for a few minutes until I came around one time and saw another door through some of the fur coats against the wall. I opened the door and it was a very narrow and dark passageway that I could only move through sideways. I came out the other end and it was to the TV area in the basement where my sister was watching TV. There had always been a door there I had never opened before. She was surprised and was like, "Where did you come from?" When I went to visit again a year later, I could not find the door in the closet, and when I checked the door in the TV area, which still existed, and looked down the narrow passageway, it led to nothing, just a wall. I know for a fact that there was never any work done to the house, and I remember it way too well for it to be a dream. So I'm no longer allowed to talk about paranormal things in my household, married, 23 and now have 4 dogs, because I've had quite a few things happen to me growing up. Well, on July 4, 2020 in Alaska, me, my wife, my buddy, and his wife decided to go to the hot springs and rent a cabin. While there, we came up on the subject of paranormal and I explained the things that had happened to me previously. We laughed about it and I started playing around later on in the restaurant they had there, like if you're there flicker the lights, and weirdly enough one did flicker hard. Ignoring it, I seen a bird feeder out the window and decided on, if you're truly there, make this bird leave, thinking it would fly away eventually. Instead it got absolutely bodied by a much larger bird. Horrified, my wife decided that was enough for me. That night my buddy's wife had something tug her hair in her sleep and had seen something. My wife had something wake her up, but it was completely silent. After going home, our household there continued to have paranormal noises, and our 2 dogs at the time occasionally stopped and stared at the doorway with nothing there or where they were looking, and would growl and bark viciously. Like hares standing on their backs, more than I've seen when they've actually fought each other. Also, something wouldn't let my wife sleep for 4 days straight by pushing on her legs when she was almost asleep and making noises in the hallways. I even talked about it at her friend's place, and soon after they had experienced paranormal things too. So consequently I've been banned from talking about these things out loud. Not really sure what to make of it, but sounds like a Ouija board is the last thing I should touch. I own land in the mountains and camp there sometimes. One night I was awake around 4 a.m. lying still in my hammock looking at the stars. Then, disturbingly close by, I heard the unmistakable sound of something big, with a big bladder, urinate. I could clearly hear the sound change as the hard dry dirt became wet, then a small puddle, then a muddy puddle as the stream went on and on. The most common animals large enough to pee that long and loud are deer and coyotes, and there are also bobcats and rarely wolves and bears. Never figured out what it actually was. I fell back asleep and woke when the sun was well up. No prints or telltale puddle to be found. I was a ranger for Glacier National Park in northern Montana. We got a call around 3 Amish for camper in distress near our post, but would require a 45 minutes hike through some pretty rocky terrain to get there. So we geared up and start hiking. Me and my partner are about 30 minutes into our hike when I just get a gut feeling that something isn't right. Keep in mind it's pitch black, only using headlamps in the middle of grizzly territory. We are about 10 minutes out and we start to hear this sound of a baby crying, so we kick it into high gear and start shouting and moving faster until I notice something odd and my gut completely dropped. The sound of the child crying was played on a loop. It was the same cry over and over again. I told my partner to stop and listen to prove I wasn't going crazy. He was a new hire and I just saw all the color on the kid's face vanish when he realized also. We decided to hightail it out of there, fearing for our lives and the unknown. Never got another call of a stranded camper after we left. I still get chills telling the story. My mom was in the hospital 50 miles away. I was 19. We were pretty sure this was it. I was home alone. My parents' house is big. It's off the beaten path on a small lagoon. My dad had been staying up at the hospital. That night, I went to bed about 1 a.m. I was playing on my laptop. My room was in a separate wing of the house. It can be sealed off with a single locking door. The door was shut but not locked. I have always been scared of the dark, so I had the lights in my wing on. So was the closet light. As I was messing around on GameFAQs, I saw the lights in my wing turn off. All of them. The band of light under the door went black. I hopped up in bed and stared at it. My bedroom door was unlocked and I was debating getting up to lock it, when the shut door slammed. As in, it sounded like someone straight up kicked the bottom of the door with all their strength. I remember squeaking in shock. It took me about 6 seconds to be up on both feet with a blade about 4 paces back and just right of the door. I remember thinking if the door opened, I could be on whoever it was almost instantly. I was also silently cursing that there was no light under the door anymore. No way to see the shadow of whoever was out there. Nothing happened. I was fighting off the fear of the situation and stupidly decided that going on a fence was all that was left. I didn't have a phone in my room, and my Nokia was in another wing where the house charging. I threw the door open with my knife low and my left hand in a guarded position. There was no one there. I tossed the hallway light switch on. There was no one in my wing. There was no one in the house. The burglar alarm was still on. Confused, I turned on the main house lights and sealed the wing off, and locking the door. I went back to my room and just sat there with my laptop open. My bedroom door now had a slight bow in it. A couple hours passed with me warily laying in bed. Around 3 a.m., the lights under the door went dark. Now I was terrified. My knife seemed pretty insignificant and my previous dumb courage had ran out. I scooted my bed, no easy task, against my bedroom door, grateful the door opened inward. It all felt so wrong. Like something was angry with me. I retreated to my closet and waited for the sun to come up. When the skylight in my room got bright, my courage returned and I moved the bed and exited my room. The wing door had been unlocked, which required a key from the other side. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs in the main house and realized my dad was home. I felt a little foolish as obviously he had been responsible for turning the lights off the second time. I lead my greeting with, "Oh, so it was you who turned all the lights off?" He looked at me and replied, "What? I got home about 10 minutes ago. I have zero clue what happened that night, but it never happened before that night or after. Whatever it was, it seemed to like the dark and wasn't a fan of doors. And it seemed to be in my wing of the house. My parents built the house and nothing untoward had ever taken place there. My bedroom door at my parents' house still has a bow in it to this day. This was almost 20 years ago. My mom is still alive, and for that, I'm extremely grateful." Not my experience, but one from someone I trust. Their story goes that they had some kind of creature try to trick him into letting it into his house. For some background, he lived with his parents and his home was in a pretty secluded, but nearish to the suburbs area at the time, and his mom was home with him and she was in the shower at the time of this occurrence. So the story goes that he was sitting in his room with the window open doing his regular relaxing thing when from outside the house he heard his mom call out from the outside asking him where he put the shirt he had borrowed from her. He didn't borrow such shirt and he replied by saying as such. He thought it was weird that his mother was outside and asking about a shirt, but he wrote it off. He looked out his window and couldn't see his mother anywhere, so he got up and out of his room realizing that the water was still running in his parents' shower. Weirded out, he went downstairs and called out for his mom, and her voice answered from behind the shut and locked front door. He says that her voice was very sweet and tender, using a tone that she would have used when he was little when she asked him, "Anon, please let me in." Anon isn't his real name, by the way. Just not going to use his real name. And then he says he heard the water shut off from the shower, as then the sounds of claws rolling down the front door could be heard, as the voice of his mother could be heard from behind the front door again asking to be let in. Followed immediately by a "Anon, I love you," with the sounds of claws rolling still being heard. He very quickly backed away from the door and went upstairs to retrieve his revolver, but as soon as he came back downstairs the voice and the rolling claws were gone. No trace. No nothing of who or what it could possibly have been. I was driving through rural NJ one night, headed home from a day of work in NYC. I was on Route 78, but there was some construction or an accident, so 78 was shut down and I had to take an exit. No problem, GPS rerouted me, and all was good. It was late at night, and fairly rural, so I didn't notice right away that there were no other cars around. None ahead, behind, or oncoming traffic. The moon was out, one of those nights you could have driven perfectly fine with no headlights, but of course mine were on. Just ahead of my headlight range on the right side of the road I see eyes glowing, so I slow down. As the animal comes into my headlights I can see it looks like a cat, maybe a raccoon or a possum. But then the animal started to run, and it clearly hopped as it ran. It wasn't large, maybe shin height on me, and I am 6'2". Then, to my surprise, it spread its wings and flew off. The wingspan I would have estimated at about 5 to 6 feet across. I called my brother, woke him up and told him what I saw, and he sent me a picture in the morning of the Jersey Devil, and the wings looked exactly like they did in the picture. Realistically, I probably saw an owl catch some prey, and when my lights came down the road it tried to hop and fly off the side of the road, but damn, 10 years later and I will not drive through rural NJ that late at night. I have lived in a forest my whole life and there's something that just doesn't sit right with me here. Don't call me crazy. My entire childhood I have lived in the forest with my family. Out of all of them, I'm the only one who loves to go into the woods. I'm drawn to it. I take hour and mile long walks, alone sometimes, but usually I go with a friend. I always bring a weapon, even though I'm confident that there's nothing there that will hurt me. Here there is no dangerous animals that I have seen with the human eye, but I have come into close contact with things that even I can't explain. When I was 9 years old I was having a birthday party in the middle of October. It was warm, the perfect day to go trek through the woods with some buddies. We started to head through my yard and towards the tree line, but then we stopped. One of my friends spotted something in the trees. A person? An animal? Nothing around here would have that white of a coat. This thing stood on 2 legs, so it couldn't be a cottontail deer. There was something out there, but none of us wanted to figure that out, so we ran. When I was 11, I was out on the rooftop, gazing up at the stars and looking down at my phone occasionally. Suddenly a sound started echoing around me. I thought it was an owl, but then the sound turned more into some sort of mountain lion or bobcat in distress sound. The noise changed many times, making different animal sounds, once even screaming like a girl. A fox maybe? I was too frightened, dialing everyone I knew while I was curled up in a ball against the side of the house. When I was 13, I came in contact with that white thing at the base of my neighbor's driveway. Never again would I ever peer around at night. Later that day I heard some sort of moose sound, but moose don't live around here. My entire life I have heard stories from one of my brothers about a Revolutionary War soldier circling the house, and once I saw it, but only once. That was it. I always felt safe because of it, it's sort of protecting me. Call me crazy, but nothing will keep me out of those woods. Nothing it has thrown at me so far, that is. Driving cross-country, I was going through Colorado on a state highway that was 1 lane both ways. It looked exactly like the opening scene from The Shining. I was so terrified that my truck would break down going up and down those mountains and I would be eaten by something or freeze to death or both. About 40 miles east of Cortez, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I assumed it was a wolf or something about to dart across the road, so I slowed down a bit. It wasn't a wolf, it was huge and it was the fastest thing I'd ever seen. When I slowed down, I saw it stand up on 2 legs and run across the road. It was like a furry LeBron James driving to the basket. It ran toward the mountains and I couldn't see it anymore, but I was baffled, so I came to a stop. I squinted to the left, where it had gone, and suddenly I saw 3 sets of red eyes looking back at me. I sped away going 90 miles per hour. It was 3 a.m., dark, and I had been driving a lot. So take it for what you want. I know what I saw, but I know those factors take away from it. Either way, it was creepy. This one's weird because me and my brother witnessed it. I've always been a big skeptic of ghost stories and still am, but the fear I felt this night was like nothing else. My parents live in the countryside out in the middle of nowhere, and late one night as a kid I woke up sort of like what sounded like talking and a bizarre, extremely loud beep that echoed across the whole house. My brother suddenly knocks on my door and comes in to wake me up as he's heard it too. We're both about 12-14 at the time, and we stand on the landing and it happens again. A long, low, extremely creepy beep and weird talking that we couldn't quite make out, but it sounded crazy garbled. We look outside and it is the creepiest night I've ever seen. Full moon, fog hanging perfectly on fields and reflecting the moonlight so you can just make out hedges. I think my brother opened a window, but the random talking felt like it was coming from inside. The beep happens one more time crazy loud and we run downstairs to wake up my parents. After calming us down, my dad was like, "Beeping sound? You sure it's not the smoke alarm battery lol?" and tells us to go back to bed. This was definitely not a smoke alarm sound and extremely freaked out the two of us. Occasionally after that I would see black shapes out of the corners of my eyes, especially in the kitchen, and just write it off as visual accidents and all in my head, but I always felt like something isn't quite right there, and a few times the dog ran to those corners, which freaked me right out. When I was about 12 years old, I lived in a house that was behind a church. One night, while Mom, Dad, my neighbor and myself were sitting on the back porch and just munching on some popcorn and telling scary stories, it was almost Halloween. All of a sudden, we heard the pastor of the church, who lived next to the church, scream, "Stay away." When we looked up, we saw this weird fog? Hard to really say what it was. Was kinda like the fog you see from a freezer when you open the door. Mom, Dad and my neighbor were closer to the church on the porch than I was. What they told me they saw was a female body in that fog. The pastor booked it into his house, and that fog was standing outside the door for a good 30 seconds, before it turned to our direction. I swear to God the look on its face was the scariest thing I had ever seen. I ran into the house and almost peed my pants. When Halloween rolled around, I didn't want to leave the house. I was driving home with a friend from a tournament we had gone to about 2 to 3 hours away. The whole weekend, it had been raining and storming very hard, and a lot of roads were flooded. This was Indiana, so a bunch of side roads and bridges were just gone. We had to reroute around 231, since a huge section of it was underwater from where a river had flooded. We ended up going through a few side towns and back roads that were a lot higher elevation away from other bodies of water. We were driving through one small town, and I was navigating with a GPS in the car. I would glance at it every once in a while, but I was also paying attention to what was going on outside the car, as it was raining pretty heavily still. The GPS directed us on a road that connected up with a more main one, and we were driving on it just fine, when suddenly, my buddy slams on the brakes. We're in the middle of a graveyard, and the road just ends. I look down at the GPS, and then show my buddy that the road continues straight on and straight back the way we came according to the GPS screen. He shrugs, turns around, and then we start back the way we came. Now, we had been telling ghost stories, and I was not at all sleepy or tired. We had driven on the one road the last 15 miles or so, directly through the town, and on into the countryside before we encountered the graveyard. On the way back, we made 5 to 6 turns within this graveyard through which we had just come on a straight road, that also suddenly spanned back a mile or so, before finally getting back onto the straight road we thought we were on before. I looked at the GPS again, and it was rerouting. When it finished, the route it wanted us to take was make a U-turn, and continue on County Road 200N for 10 miles. We both turned around in our seats, to confirm that we had indeed just driven through a huge graveyard, with many turns and twists in the road leading back into it. Instead, we saw the road dead-ended into a small graveyard. We immediately drove back to the town the opposite direction of the graveyard and took a different route home. No one will believe this, but in 7th grade, my friends and I went over to Mary's house intent on playing with her mom's Ouija board that night. None of us had played with one before. Mary's mom was an extremely spiritual person who believed in energies, witchcraft, stuff like that. Before we used the board, Mary warned us that her mom would be really pissed if she found out that we were playing with it. Because Ouija boards can attract bad spirits into the home. With full knowledge of this, we decided to proceed anyway. This Ouija board was not like the average Ouija board you had ever seen. Along with the usual characteristics, the alphabet, yes, no, goodbye, there was an entire array of symbols and signs that were all arranged in a circle. This was some seriously intricate stuff. We started just goofing around and communicating with random spirits here and there until we finally met one that had us in tears the entire sleepless night. First, we asked the spirit if it was a man or a woman, to which he replied man. Then we asked how he was killed, murder. That freaked us out only a little bit, but we were mostly excited. All of a sudden, before we even asked another question, the glass goes to the eyeball symbol, then spells out in, and goes to the water symbol. We didn't have a clue what that meant. It wasn't too scary until the spirit spelled out shower and my best friend realized that the spirit was trying to get us to look into the shower. We froze. I've never been so scared in my entire life, especially sitting directly in front of the bathroom with the shower curtain all the way closed, faced in my direction. We all screamed and promised on our friendships that we had not moved it ourselves, very important promise. I felt like I was being watched and my friends thought so too. It was only 4 of us and I believe with all my heart that none of them had moved it because we were all too nervous to do anything. I'll never use a Ouija board again because of how crazy and intense that night was. I understand that people say Ouija boards are controlled by your subconscious, but duck that. I know I felt something in that room with us. I know it was ducking dangerous. Not heard but experienced. I was on a college ghost hunt with a guy named Chris Fleming. Cool dude, we did all the normal college ghost hunt stuff, walking to supposedly haunted dorms and experiencing some cool stuff, but nothing crazy. The city we were in had this special place called the Ghost Trestle. It was basically a railroad bridge in the middle of a cornfield that had a dirt road underneath it. Anyways, during the ghost hunt with this guy who was actually featured on Ghost Adventures, we told him about this place. He was pumped and rushed through the rest of the college ghost hunt. Him and his assistant and a few of my friends took 2 cars with all his equipment to this Ghost Trestle. When we got there, a train was coming, so he interviewed us on camera to tell the story about this place. The story. Back a long time ago there was a farmhouse, still there but rebuilt, and a farmer, his wife, and son escaped a fire in the house. Also on fire was the horse stables. The farmer ran in to try and rescue the horse before they succumbed to the fire, while the wife and son went to wave down a train that was passing by. The story ends with the farmer dying in the stable fire, and as the wife and child were waving down the train they were struck and killed. To this day, if you park your car under the bridge while a train crossed you above, it's supposed to open up another dimensional world to be able to communicate. Well, we show up and of course to our luck there is a train coming. We all freaked out and got pumped while the medium Chris Fleming attempted to communicate. We were all taking pictures and began to experience weird technological failures. My camera, which was my own, began flashing and taking multiple pictures. Same thing was occurring with our disposable camera Chris Fleming's assistant had. At one point we began to see stuff mostly out of the corner of our eyes, and Chris attempted to communicate, but whatever spirit was there seemed more intimidated. He, Chris, believed it to be the spirit of the little boy. I can honestly say that I was young and thought this stuff was hoax and just fun for college kids to pretend. Until this night when we had a real professional experience the same thing we all did. Fast forward to a year or two after this event. I came to this same place for the first time since the night we went with Chris Fleming. This time it was just me and my then GF. I parked under the bridge, turned off the car and lights and took the key out of the ignition. We were joking together about how we were getting too old for this stuff. And when I looked in the rear view mirror, I saw a black shadow flash by the rear window of my car, followed by some noises that sounds like someone running towards my car. My heart never raced so fast to put my key into the ignition and peel out and get out of there. Whatever it was didn't seem like it wanted us there, and I have yet to drive under or by the bridge since. Back in the mid-1990s, me and a guy I used to go to school with were walking his dog in the woods out the back of his parents' house. It isn't a particularly remote spot, but it's far enough away from the nearest town that it gets virtually zero light pollution, and we wanted to go right out over the fields to stare at the stars. As we headed up an access road leading through the woods, it started to snow pretty heavily. The hill we had to climb to get to the best star watching spot is the highest point for miles around, and it tends to have its own weather system. The strong winds which blow in off the coast whip over the top of the hill and get pushed high into the atmosphere, which rapidly cools the water vapor and causes it to rain and snow pretty much all the time. This has to have something to do with what happened to us next, but it was the strangest and most unnerving experience of my life. As we got to the end of this long road, the snow started to swirl in a geometric pattern, a bit like helicopter blades. There was an electric charge in the air, which we could smell like static on nylon. As it swirled faster and faster, the snow started to make a buzzing sound, like something mechanical. We just stood there and watched these amazing patterns spin above our heads. Then the dog, which had been running off and reappearing briefly, only to dash off again exploring, suddenly decided there was something it didn't like out there. She clung close to us and started to nervously whine. As she did, the spinning shapes started to flash, as if there were thousands of LEDs scattered through the snow, but not in a random way. They seemed to outline the boxy, unnatural shapes in the snow swirls, and they were flashing different bright colors. The buzzing sound became louder and louder, until we had to shout over it to one another. After about 10 minutes it started to ease off, until eventually it completely stopped. We just looked at each other, like what the duck just happened? And started to walk back home. Everyone we told about it later on said we were imagining it, but it really did happen. Many years later, in a weird twist of fate, long after my school friend's parents moved out of the area, a guy I used to work with and occasionally socialize with bought the same house. One night, I was telling him about what happened to me when I was a teenager, over in the back fields. As I told him more and more detail of the story, he started to stare at me in disbelief. He'd lived in the area all his life, and when he was a kid, him and his brother took a tent out to the same spot to camp in the woods, but they didn't stay all night, because they'd been woken up in the middle of the night by a strange whirring sound and flashing lights in the sky. They were so freaked out, they left the tent and ran back home. We stayed in touch after we both got different jobs, and often dare one another to go back out there one night, and see if it happens again. We've scoured the internet for explanations of strange weather phenomena, but none of the ones we've found exactly match the description of geometric shapes, with the buzzing sound. I'd love to know what it actually was, because there has to be a natural explanation for it. But even knowing that, I still get a chill down my neck when I think about how eerie the whole experience was. My mother's stepfather was an accountant at a small college in East Texas. He was a very kind, meticulous, handyman type of guy that kept to himself and was big on honesty. He passed away about a decade ago, and it wasn't until recently that my grandmother told me this story. It was late one Sunday night when they were making the trip back from Glen Rose, Texas, to their small home in East Texas. Around 1 a.m., my grandmother had fallen asleep in the passenger seat and my grandfather was wide awake, sipping a McDonald's coffee when she was jolted awake by the car coming to a screeching halt. My grandfather was wide-eyed. In a panic, my grandmother asked him what had happened. She says that he could barely speak and was absolutely terrified by what he claims he saw. It was a furry little man, gremlin-like creature with huge round eyes and razor-sharp teeth standing in the middle of the road. It was crouching as if it was about to jump onto their car and attack them. As soon as my grandfather rounded the corner, he slammed on his brakes in an attempt to avoid hitting it. He claimed that it began to run at the car, lunged towards them and then immediately disappeared before it hit the windshield. She said that he was so shaken up, he asked her to stay awake for the next 2 hours and hold his hand as he drove into Dallas. This was an honest, hard-working man in his 60s who wouldn't tell you a false story, even if it merited a light-hearted reaction. This story is from my friend. We were at college together and lived in separate buildings. It was the middle of fall and the weather had been pretty cold and rainy lately, with the nights having a thick fog. He had been fairly sick for a few days and would go to class and then go back home to sleep. One night he fell asleep and awoke feeling a lot better. While getting ready for class, he was looking in his desk's drawers for his favorite pen and found a rough sketch of Wendigo-looking creature. He has no memory of drawing this, hadn't seen any art or stories that would make this come to mind, and had a few dreams of this creature over the next few years. One dream, he was in a forest after the first snow and saw this creature standing there 7 to 8 feet tall. It had a long cloak and you couldn't see the feet, and where it walked no footprints were left behind. It slowly turned towards him, raised up an arm and pointed at him and spoke words from another language in a deep bass as dry leaves came out of the mouth. The creepy past is 2 other people he's talked to have experienced dreams of this same creature, and a girl's grandmother who immigrated from Europe said in the old country they used to call that the devil. So that's cool. This is what happened to me and a bunch of friends one night in Christchurch, NZ. So at age 17 to 18 my friends and I decided it would be a good idea to head up to the old battlements at a place called Godley Head. Mind you, this was around midnight. So we take the 20-minute drive up there and walk along the track, getting to the battlements without a worry. We proceeded to explore the battlements, joking about finding homeless people up there, and how we would shit ourselves and run. So for 15 to 20 minutes we explored, finding no one, when we decided we should head back to the surface and figure out what to do next. Once on the surface and talking, someone pointed out a figure walking across the path, probably 100 meters from us. There was a lot of star and moonlight. So we all watched the figure disappear out of sight. At this point one of the girls asked to leave because she was getting spooked. So we all start to walk back towards the cars, when we saw this figure up ahead again. The figure were crossing back over the path, heading towards where we wanted to exit. At this point we called out to them as we were now all getting spooked. But there was no response. So all well and truly freaked out now, we decided to take an alternate route to the cars. However, even with this route the final stretch was the same as the original path. So off we go. As we come up to the final stretch we spot the figure again, except this time it's just standing on the side of the path. We all stop and decide to try make our way past this person, so grouped together with the girls on the far side we cautiously walked towards the figure. It didn't move, at all. Well, not until we were almost past, then it started to walk towards us, so we all ran like little children, got in the car and didn't look back. I live in Lubbock, Texas. One night, I was talking to someone online, and made an innocuous comment that for whatever reason opened a floodgate. This person basically stated that they had no reason to live, and went into great detail about how worthless they felt. At first, I was just surprised, but a still small voice said, "Pray for this person, they are at the brink of death." I shrugged it off, kind of, and mentally wished them well and tried to get them to stay positive. Again, the still small voice said, "Pray for them. Come between them and this darkness that seeks to kill them." Since I don't talk that way, I knew this wasn't me, so I started to pray. Things calmed down, and they signed off. I went outside, feeling a bit drained from dealing with all that so unexpectedly. Now, I have lived in Lubbock for 3 years at this point. I know what kind of birds there are and are not in this town. I am also not prone to imagining things. Outside my house is an old tree, and suddenly I felt I was being watched from up in the tree. It was the most malevolent feeling I have ever felt in my entire life, like absolutely pure and distilled hatred. Then I heard a noise I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was like a crow, only deep and guttural. It was just a short gra-awk, but I can tell you I almost peed my pants. Then, again, the still small voice said to me calmly, "Just turn around, and walk calmly back inside. Don't be afraid." It was very hard not to run, but I walked inside and didn't look back. I was 12 and it was the evening before the first day of deer season in a small Pennsylvania town on the New York State border. And as it was a bit of a tradition in the family, we, my few cousins, and 2 uncles, to get an early start in the morning, stayed at my great-grandmother's house. The house was a small affair with 2 crowded stories that were stuffed with the detritus that a little old lady collected over a lifetime. Sadly though, she had passed many years before, but my uncle lived on in the house. So, after a day of sighting and hunting rifles and eating sloppy joes, we divvied up the sleeping arrangements. As luck would have it, I claimed one of the small bedrooms upstairs. And after unloading my grab bag of weighted clothing, boots and whatnot into that room, it was time to go to bed. The spare bedroom consisted of a large, old, brass bed, a dresser with a mirror on which dusty trinkets were arrayed. While on the far side of the bed a small folding chair sat dusty and unused in the corner. Things were arranged in the room such that while laying in bed, if one looked to left, there was the far edge of the bed, and the folding chair in the corner pointing the same direction as one laid in the bed. So if someone sat in the chair, the person would be facing the same direction as the person laying in the bed. There was also a small walkway between the edge of the bed where the chair was and the wall where a window was located. Then at the right corner of the bed, basically where my feet were positioned, there was the dresser, of which the dresser's corner nearly touched the corner of the bed. It was so close, in fact, that you really had to climb over the bed to get by the corner of the dresser. Anyway, I go to bed and I either dozed or outright slept for some time, and when I come to, all is dark and quiet with moonlight streaming through the window. I remember it being clear enough to see the patterns on the wallpaper, so dark it was not. When I glance at the moonlit window to my left, I notice someone sitting quietly in the chair. I should have been able to see the details of the person with the moonlight the way it was, but it was simply a black silhouette motionless in the chair. Christ, I'm getting goosebumps telling this after 35 years. The black figure in the chair, for that's all there was, sits for a moment. Then the figure abruptly stands, and it is enormous, 6+ feet tall and big. The figure was way bigger than my uncle, who I could clearly hear snoring in the next room. The figure stands, then walks without noise in the little walkway down to the end of the bed, then turns right at the base of the bed. At this moment I try to scream. And I clearly remember opening my mouth and pushing hard, but the only thing to escape was a whistling and wheezing sound. I was so terrified I could not scream. The figure moved silently along the end of the bed to where the bed corner, the dresser corner, and my feet met. The thing then slipped between the two pieces of furniture as if there were space enough to fit such a large person. And no sound. No soft rattle of bumped knickknacks and perfume bottles, which were arranged on the dresser. Nothing. Just a black figure moving silently in the moonlight. After the figure moved between the bed and dresser, it came to stand over me. It was a towering silhouette with a head, shoulders, torso, and legs clearly visible in the moonlit room. It was a blocky shape, almost as if it were wearing a man's suit. But no visual details, just a black cardboard cutout standing over me. Silently standing. I tried again to scream. Again nothing but the hiss of trapped breath came out. It then bent over me with its arms crossed in front of it. I can't tell you how I knew this, but it was clear to me even though I do not remember seeing the arms articulate in such a manner. It bent over and pushed on my chest 3 distinct times, all the while with no sound except the bed squeaking under the weight. 3 times in evenly spaced successions the thing did this. 1, 2, 3, just as I counted out to you here. And then it was as if I blinked, or maybe I woke up, except there was no break in what I was seeing. The thing was just gone, the chair was empty, and I was alone in the room again. It was as if during the time that thing came out of the corner, time had stopped. And the thing performed its obscure ritual. Then time snapped back into motion again, like after some freeze-frame animation, with only the prime movers animate within the scene with everything else frozen. That was last time I ever slept in my great-grandmother's house again. To this day I have gone over those events thousands of times, and for the life of me it was real. It was as real as you and I sitting here in this small, quiet room. 3 high school friends and I went for our annual camping trip, this time in Huntsville, Texas. We planned to fish and trap our food, like we always do. As we hiked into the forest, catching up and making camp at dusk, we smelled something odd but ignored it. That night, while sharing ghost stories around the fire, Mike went to relieve himself and came back scared, wet with piss, urging us to follow him. We ran into the woods, following his flashlight, towards a distant crying sound. A dilapidated cabin came into view with faint light in one window. The crying stopped abruptly when Mike knocked, and heavy footsteps responded. We heard a slam, but no one answered the door. Peering in through a window, Alex let out a blood-curdling scream and ran back towards the camp, hysterical. By sunrise, Alex had bitten his cheeks in a frenzy and looked lost. When Mike and I went to find the cabin in daylight, it was gone, replaced with a strong, stale odor of death. We returned to find Alex and John in bad shape, insisting we leave. As we packed and left in a heavy downpour, we found a flooded creek blocking our path. That's when Alex revealed he'd seen a terrifying face, mirrored against his, smiling disturbingly wide in the cabin window. Something had sliced off its face and it slid down, laughing. The unsettling sight of old toys floating in the creek and shadows moving in the trees rattled us further. Then, the cabin reappeared, surrounded by an eerie chorus of whispering, singing, and laughter from hundreds of old baby dolls. We hurriedly crossed the creek and exited the forest, the stale smell and unsettling sounds trailing us. We found a young, distressed-looking girl on our detour out who tried to enter our vehicle, but Alex wouldn't let her. She smiled chillingly wide against the window as we sped away. After returning home, things were never the same. Mike vanished without a trace. Alex's parents denied knowing him, and John was unreachable. Everywhere, I smell that stale death, and everyone I meet, including my father, acts weirdly, their eyes black and mouths wide open in torment. It's like the forest horror followed us back, and the haunting memories of the cabin refused to fade. When I was a kid, maybe like 11 or 12, I came home from school one day to make myself a snack, and I opened our cutlery drawer to find distinctly different forks than the ones we had always had. Like, 3 prongs instead of 4, different shaped tines, different shaped handles. Subtle, but unmistakable, I had been using these all of my life up until that point. I showed them to my family, bemused at first, stating bluntly, "Oh, we got new forks?" Everyone denied it. "No, these are the forks we've always had." My alarm grew. Clearly, they had bought new forks. I had eaten every meal of my life with the same forks. I knew my forks. These were not them. I insisted. They persisted. These were the forks we have always had. They began to look at me strangely. I pointed out the clear and obvious differences. The tines. Look at the tines. My father, ever the joker, shrugged and said, "The tines, they are changing." To this day, I swear I must have stepped through some hyperdimensional membrane into a parallel universe, the most boring and mundane alternative reality where the only difference was the choice of forks that my parents had purchased years prior. People often imagine the multiverse to be populated with interesting and bizarre permutations, but if it is truly infinite, logically most of the realities are boringly similar to ours, but different in only one minor way. This is simply the way that I have come to rationalize and cope with this childhood experience. I am very serious that it happened the way I remember it, and have no other explanation.